The radio crackled to life at 11:47 p.m., cutting through the quiet hum of the Atlanta PD patrol unit. Officer Sarah Collins glanced at her partner in the passenger seat, not the human kind, but the four-legged hero who had been by her side for 6 years. Max, her Belgian Malinois, lifted his head from his resting position, ears perked at the familiar sound that meant another night's work was about to begin. Unit 47. We have a possible drug operation in progress at the old Riverside warehouse district. Multiple suspects reported, may be armed and dangerous. Canine assistance specifically requested for narcotics detection. Sarah's green eyes hardened with the focused intensity that had made her one of Atlanta's most respected K-9 officers. She reached for the radio with her left hand, while her right instinctively moved to check her service weapon. Unit 47 responding. ETA 12 minutes. She glanced at Max through the rearview mirror, whose intelligent brown eyes met hers with that familiar spark of understanding. Ready for work, boy? Max's tail gave a single, controlled wag, his professional response that meant he was always ready. After 6 years together, their communication had evolved beyond words into something deeper, more intuitive. Sarah could read Max's moods as easily as she could read a suspect's body language, and tonight, something felt different. The warehouse district loomed ahead like a concrete graveyard, shadows dancing between rusted buildings and broken streetlights that had been dark for years. The city had long ago forgotten this corner of Atlanta, leaving it to decay and become a haven for criminal activity. Sarah killed the engine 2 blocks away from their target, the sudden silence immediately swallowing them in an oppressive blanket of anticipation. She stepped out into the humid Georgia night, adjusting her tactical vest and checking her service weapon, while Max waited patiently in the back seat. His black and tan coat made him nearly invisible in the darkness, a genetic advantage that had served them well in countless operations. The weight of her badge felt heavier tonight, though she couldn't explain why. "This feels wrong," Sarah whispered to herself, studying the eerily quiet scene through narrowed eyes. In her 8 years on the force, she had learned to trust her instincts above all else. They had saved her life more times than she could count, and tonight they were screaming warnings she couldn't ignore. She opened Max's door and attached his tactical harness, the reflective identification strips gleaming faintly under the distant streetlight. The harness was equipped with a small camera and GPS tracker, standard equipment that had helped solve dozens of cases. Max stood perfectly still as she secured the straps, his professional demeanor a stark contrast to the playful dog he became at home. They approached the target building with practiced precision, each step calculated and silent. Max's nose worked overtime, cataloging every scent that crossed their path: trash, rust, motor oil, and something else. Something chemical and sharp that made his nostrils flare with recognition. Suddenly he froze, in the distinctive alert position that Sarah had seen thousands of times before. His body went rigid, his nose pointed directly at the warehouse entrance, and his tail stood at attention. The behavior was unmistakable. Drugs. Lots of them. "Good boy," she whispered, her hand finding the familiar comfort of Max's tactical harness. The validation of their intelligence felt good, but her unease continued to grow. Where was backup? The radio had been silent since her initial response, and protocol demanded additional units for this type of operation. The warehouse door stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. It felt like an invitation, but Sarah's experience told her it was more likely a trap. Every instinct screamed at her to wait for backup, but the thought of suspects escaping with evidence made her hesitate. She made the decision that would haunt her forever. "Let's go, Max." They entered the building together, her flashlight beam cutting through the dusty air like a sword. The warehouse was massive, filled with stacked boxes and industrial equipment covered in years of neglect. The chemical smell of methamphetamine production hung heavy in the atmosphere, confirming Max's alert and making Sarah's eyes water. Max stayed close, his trained instincts sharp as ever, but something was different about his behavior. He kept looking back at her, as if trying to communicate something beyond his usual professional signals. Sarah had never seen him act this way before, and it added another layer to her growing anxiety. They moved deeper into the warehouse, checking corners and clearing spaces with military precision. Sarah's radio remained stubbornly silent. Backup should have been here by now. The silence felt wrong, artificial, like the calm before a storm that would change everything. Then everything went catastrophically wrong. The explosion of sound came from everywhere at once, shouts in multiple languages, running footsteps echoing off concrete walls, the metallic clang of weapons being readied. Sarah spun around, her training kicking in as figures emerged from behind the stacked boxes, like ghosts materializing from shadows. At least 6 men, all armed with military-grade weapons, all moving with the deadly coordination of professionals who had done this before. "Atlanta PD, drop your weapons," she shouted, but her voice was lost in the orchestrated chaos erupting around her. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Sarah dove behind a concrete pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs as bullets sparked off the floor around her. "Max, stay!" she commanded, but when she looked back, her blood ran cold with a terror she had never experienced before. Max was surrounded. 3 men had flanked them during the initial chaos, moving with tactical precision that spoke of military training. One held a specialized capture pole, the kind used by animal control, but modified with electrical components that could subdue without killing. This wasn't random violence. This was a planned operation with a specific target, her partner. Her Max. "Max!" Sarah's voice broke as she watched her partner struggle against the trap, his powerful body fighting against the electrical current designed to weaken his resistance. The men worked with practiced efficiency, their movements coordinated like a well-rehearsed dance of abduction. She fired 3 shots in rapid succession, dropping one assailant, but the others were already dragging Max toward a rear exit that had been prepared for their escape. His yelps of pain and confusion tore through her chest like bullets, each sound a dagger in her heart. "Officer down! Officer down! I need immediate backup at Riverside Warehouse," she screamed into her radio, desperation making her voice crack, but only static answered her pleas. The silence on the radio told her everything she needed to know. This had been a setup from the beginning. By the time she fought her way to the rear exit, dodging gunfire and using every tactical skill she possessed, they were gone. Max was gone. Only tire tracks in the alley and the lingering smell of diesel exhaust remained as evidence that her world had just been torn apart. Sarah Collins stood alone in the empty alley, her weapon still drawn, her uniform torn and dirty. Her whole world collapsed into a single, devastating reality. Her partner, her best friend, the closest thing to family she had ever known, was gone into the night, and she had no idea if she would ever see him again. 3 weeks had passed since that nightmare at the warehouse, and Sarah Collins felt like she was slowly dying inside. Every morning, she woke up expecting to hear Max's familiar whine asking for breakfast, only to be met with crushing silence. The empty dog bed in the corner of her bedroom had become a monument to her failure, and she couldn't bring herself to move it. The Atlanta Police Department had launched a full investigation, but the leads were as cold as winter rain. The warehouse had been cleaned out within hours of the incident, leaving behind only scorch marks and the lingering smell of chemicals. Security cameras in the area had mysteriously malfunctioned that night, and the radio interference during her call for backup had been traced to sophisticated jamming equipment that suggested professional involvement. Captain Rodriguez had been sympathetic but realistic. "Sarah, I know Max meant everything to you, but we can't allocate unlimited resources to this case. We have to consider the possibility that—" He never finished the sentence, but Sarah knew what he was thinking. Dead dogs don't generate ransom calls, but Sarah refused to accept that possibility. Every free moment was spent following leads that went nowhere, interviewing informants who knew nothing, and driving through neighborhoods where stolen police dogs might be hidden. Her apartment walls were covered with maps, photographs, and timelines that painted a picture of obsession more than investigation. Her phone buzzed constantly with well-meaning messages from fellow officers offering support, but Sarah had stopped answering most calls. The only person she still talked to was Detective Marcus Webb, her former partner, before she'd transferred to canine units. Marcus understood that Max wasn't just a working animal, he was family. "You look like hell," Marcus said, sliding into the booth across from her at their usual diner. It was 2 a.m., and the place was nearly empty, except for a few night shift workers grabbing coffee before heading home. "I feel worse than I look," Sarah replied, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate without eating them. Dark circles under her green eyes told the story of countless sleepless nights. "I got a lead yesterday. Someone saw a police dog at an underground auction house on the east side." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. "Sarah, you can't keep chasing every rumor. These people are dangerous, and if they took Max for a reason, going in alone is suicide." "Then come with me," she said, meeting his eyes with the intensity that made him uncomfortable. "We've worked together before. You know I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate." Meanwhile, across the city in a cramped apartment that smelled of poverty and determination, 19-year-old Emma Rodriguez was counting coins on her kitchen table for the third time, hoping the math would somehow change. $47.38. It wasn't enough for her grandmother's heart medication, and it certainly wasn't enough for the rent that was already 2 weeks overdue. Emma's life had been a series of unfortunate events strung together by sheer willpower and love for the only family she had left. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 16, leaving her to care for her grandmother Maria, whose heart condition required expensive medication that insurance barely covered. Emma worked 3 jobs to make ends meet, cleaning offices at night, serving breakfast at a diner during early morning hours, and doing whatever odd job she could find in between. Her latest employment opportunity had come through a friend of a friend who knew someone who needed cleaning services for special events. The pay was cash, no questions asked, which was exactly what Emma needed. She didn't ask about the nature of these special events, and she didn't want to know. Survival had taught her that ignorance was sometimes the safest policy. The warehouse on Merchant Street looked abandoned from the outside, but Emma had learned that appearances could be deceiving. 3 nights a week, she arrived at midnight to clean up after whatever had happened there during the evening hours. The money was good, better than anything else she could find, and the work was straightforward. Clean the cages, mop the floors, remove any evidence that animals had been there. She tried not to think about what kind of animals, or why they needed to be cleaned up after so thoroughly. Tonight felt different from the moment she walked through the service entrance. Usually the place was empty except for the lingering smells and scattered debris from whatever had transpired. But tonight, she could hear sounds coming from the back room, whimpering, scratching, and the kind of distressed animal noises that made her stomach twist with guilt. Emma hesitated at the doorway, her cleaning supplies heavy in her hands. Her instructions had been explicit: clean the main area, don't go into the back rooms, don't ask questions, don't see anything that might require her to remember details later. But the sounds were breaking her heart. Against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed, Emma pushed open the door to the back room. What she saw made her drop her mop bucket with a crash that echoed through the concrete space. Cages lined the walls, most of them empty, but some containing dogs in various states of distress. These weren't ordinary strays or abandoned pets. These were clearly valuable animals, purebreds with the kind of training and conditioning that spoke of professional backgrounds. Police dogs, military working dogs, expensive breeding stock that had been stolen from their rightful owners. But it was the dog in the corner cage that made Emma's breath catch in her throat. He was magnificent, even in his current condition. A Belgian Malinois with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold a universe of sadness and confusion. His black and tan coat was matted and dirty, but she could see the remnants of a tactical harness that had been hastily removed. This was definitely a police dog, and from the way he held himself despite his circumstances, he had been someone's beloved partner. Their eyes met across the room, and Emma felt something shift inside her chest. The dog didn't bark or show aggression like the others. Instead, he watched her with a quiet dignity that spoke of training, loyalty, and a trust in humans that hadn't been completely broken despite his situation. Emma knew in that moment that she was looking at someone's family member, someone's partner, someone's best friend, who was probably being mourned and searched for with the same desperation she would feel if something happened to her grandmother. She also knew that tomorrow night this room would be empty again, and all these dogs would be gone forever. The $47.38 on her kitchen table suddenly seemed less important than the life looking back at her with eyes that held more wisdom and pain than she had ever seen in a human being. Emma Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. She was going to save him, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had left. The underground auction was scheduled for tomorrow night, and she would be there with every penny she owned, ready to bid on a life that was worth more than money could ever measure. As she walked home through the empty streets of Atlanta, Emma didn't know that across the city, a heartbroken police officer was staring at the ceiling of her apartment, unable to sleep, still believing that somewhere out there, her partner was waiting for her to find him. Neither of them knew that their lives were about to intersect in a way that would restore faith in the possibility that sometimes, against all odds, love finds a way to bridge the gap between despair and hope. The underground auction felt like descending into hell itself. Emma Rodriguez stood at the entrance of the warehouse, her $47.38 burning a hole in her pocket like stolen fire. The money represented everything: her grandmother's medication, next week's groceries, the gas bill that would be shut off if not paid by Friday. But none of that mattered anymore. She had spent the entire day agonizing over her decision, sitting beside her grandmother's bed and watching the elderly woman sleep fitfully. Her breathing labored from the heart condition that required medication they could barely afford. Maria Rodriguez had raised Emma after her parents died, working 3 jobs to keep them afloat until her own health began failing. Now it was Emma's turn to be the provider, and she was about to gamble everything on a dog she had seen for less than 5 minutes. "Mija, you look troubled," her grandmother had whispered that afternoon, her weathered hand reaching for Emma's. "What's wrong?" Emma couldn't explain. How do you tell someone that you're about to spend their last hope on saving a stranger's dog? How do you justify risking everything for an animal when your own family needs that money to survive? But looking into her grandmother's kind eyes, Emma remembered something Maria had always taught her. Sometimes, Mija, we must choose between surviving and living. Surviving is about keeping your body alive. Living is about keeping your soul alive. The warehouse buzzed with an energy that felt dangerous and electric. Men in expensive suits mingled with others who looked like they had crawled out of Atlanta's darkest corners. Everyone spoke in hushed tones, their eyes constantly scanning for threats or opportunities. Emma tried to make herself invisible, pulling her worn denim jacket tighter around her thin frame and keeping her head down. A makeshift stage had been constructed at the far end of the warehouse, with cages arranged in rows like merchandise waiting to be sold. The sight made Emma's stomach turn. These weren't just animals. They were someone's companions, partners, family members who had been torn away from everything they knew and loved. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's special acquisition event," announced a thin man with gold teeth and a voice like gravel. "We have some exceptional specimens tonight, including several professionally trained working animals that will make excellent additions to private security operations or breeding programs." Emma's hands shook as she clutched her money. She had never been to an auction before, had no idea how the bidding worked, no strategy beyond desperation and hope. Around her, people held up numbered cards with the casual ease of those accustomed to buying and selling lives. The first several animals were dogs she didn't recognize, German shepherds, Rottweilers, even a few exotic breeds that probably belonged in zoos rather than private collections. The bidding was aggressive, with prices climbing into thousands of dollars that made Emma's $47 seem pathetically inadequate. Then they brought out Max. Even from across the warehouse, Emma could see the difference in how he carried himself. Where the other dogs showed signs of fear, confusion, or aggression, Max maintained a dignity that spoke of his training and character. His black and tan coat had been brushed clean for the auction, but Emma could see the weight loss and the sadness in his intelligent brown eyes. Next, we have a genuine Belgian Malinois, professionally trained for police work, the auctioneer announced with obvious pride. This animal has been certified in narcotics detection, tracking and protection services. Estimated value in legitimate markets would exceed $15,000. We'll start bidding at $500. Emma's heart sank. $500 might as well have been $5 million. She watched helplessly as hands shot up around the room, the price climbing rapidly past her meager resources. $800, $1,000, $1,200, $1,500. Each bid felt like another nail in the coffin of her impossible dream, but then something strange happened. The bidding slowed, then stopped entirely at $1,600. Emma looked around in confusion, expecting the gavel to fall and Max to be sold to the highest bidder. Instead, the auctioneer looked frustrated. "Folks, I need to inform you that this particular animal has been problematic. He's refused food for the past week, won't respond to commands from anyone, and has shown signs of depression that might affect his future performance. While his training is exceptional, his current psychological state makes him a risky investment." The man who had bid $1,600 shook his head and lowered his card. Others followed suit, apparently unwilling to invest in an animal that might not perform as expected. Emma watched in amazement as the price dropped. $1,500, $1,000, $800, $500. "Do I hear $400? The auctioneer called out, his enthusiasm clearly dampened by the lack of interest. No hands went up. Emma felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the warehouse could hear it. $300? Still nothing. The crowd was already losing interest, turning their attention to the next cage being wheeled onto the stage. $200? Come on, folks. This is a trained police dog we're talking about. Emma's hand trembled as she slowly raised it. Every person in her section turned to look at the young woman in the worn jacket who had just bid on an animal worth more than most people's cars. "I have $200 from the young lady in section C. Do I hear $250? The warehouse was quiet except for the sound of Emma's racing heartbeat. She closed her eyes and prayed to every saint her grandmother had ever mentioned, begging for a miracle she didn't deserve. Going once at $200, going twice. $250! Called out a voice from the back of the warehouse. Emma's heart shattered. She looked down at her remaining money. Not enough to compete, not enough to save him, not enough to matter in a world where everything had a price, and she couldn't afford any of it. But then she heard something that changed everything. A soft whimper from the stage. Max was looking directly at her. Somehow, through all the noise and chaos of the auction, he had found her in the crowd. Their eyes met across the warehouse, and Emma saw something in his gaze that she recognized. The same desperate hope she felt, the same need for someone to care, the same fear of being abandoned by a world that saw them as expendable. $300, Emma shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. The bidder in the back hesitated, studying the young woman who was clearly bidding beyond her means. Something in her desperation must have communicated itself to him, because he slowly shook his head and lowered his card. "I have $300 from section C. Do I hear $350? The warehouse fell silent. Emma held her breath, counting every second that passed without another bid. Max continued to watch her with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand exactly what was happening. Going once at $300, going twice, sold to the young lady in section C for $300. Emma's legs nearly gave out. She had won. Somehow, impossibly, she had saved him. But as she walked toward the payment table with shaking hands, the full weight of what she had done hit her like a physical blow. $300. It was more than half of everything she had. Her grandmother's medication would have to wait. The gas bill would go unpaid. They would eat rice and beans for the next 2 weeks, assuming they could even afford rice and beans. But as they brought Max down from the stage and handed her his leash, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that she had done the right thing, regardless of the consequences. Max looked up at her with eyes that seemed to say thank you in a language that transcended words. He was thin and tired and clearly traumatized by his ordeal, but there was something unbroken in his spirit that called to her own stubborn refusal to give up. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, kneeling down to his level as they processed the paperwork. "You're safe now. I don't have much, but whatever I have, we'll share it." Max pressed his head against her hand in a gesture so gentle and trusting that Emma felt tears she couldn't afford to shed beginning to blur her vision. She had spent her last coins on a leap of faith, betting everything on the belief that sometimes love matters more than money, that sometimes saving someone else is the only way to save yourself. Walking out of that warehouse with Max beside her, Emma Rodriguez had no idea that she had just set in motion a chain of events that would bring her face to face with the one person in Atlanta who'd been searching for this dog with the same desperate love that had motivated her to save him. She didn't know that across the city, Officer Sarah Collins was still awake, still hoping, still believing that somehow, somewhere, her partner was waiting for her to find him. And she had no idea that Max, loyal, intelligent, grateful Max, was about to become the bridge between two worlds that needed each other more than either of them could possibly imagine. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source, a homeless veteran named Tommy, who survived by collecting recyclables and trading information for spare change. Sarah had been working her network of street contacts for weeks, following every whisper and rumor about stolen police dogs, underground auctions, and suspicious animal movements through Atlanta's shadows. "Officer Collins," Tommy called out as Sarah walked past his usual spot near the interstate overpass. His weathered face was animated with excitement. "I got something for you about that dog you've been looking for." Sarah's heart jumped, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had followed dozens of false leads over the past month, each one raising her hopes only to crush them again. "What do you have, Tommy?" "My friend Jessie, she works cleaning up after them auction folks over on Merchant Street. Says she's seen a girl, real young, maybe 19 or 20, walking a police dog yesterday morning. Said the dog looked just like that picture you've been showing around." Sarah's pulse quickened. She pulled out her phone and showed Tommy the photo of Max again, his official canine unit portrait, where he sat at attention in his tactical harness, looking every inch the professional law enforcement officer he was. "That's him," Tommy said without hesitation. "Jessie said the girl looked poor, real poor, but she was taking good care of that dog. Had him on a makeshift leash, but he was walking right beside her like he belonged there. Said they was heading toward the Riverside Apartments." The Riverside apartment complex was a sprawling collection of low-income housing units where Sarah had responded to countless domestic disputes and drug calls over the years. It wasn't a place where she expected to find Max, but Tommy's information felt different from the other leads she had chased, more specific, more real. "Tommy, if this pans out, I owe you dinner for a month," Sarah said, already moving toward her patrol car. "Just find your partner, Officer Collins. That's all the payment I need." The Riverside complex looked exactly as Sarah remembered. Tired buildings with peeling paint, broken playground equipment, and the general air of resignation that came with poverty. She parked her patrol car and began the systematic process of knocking on doors, showing Max's photo and asking questions. It was Mrs. Patterson on the second floor of Building C who provided the next piece of the puzzle. "Oh yes, I seen that dog," the elderly woman said, adjusting her glasses to look at the photo more closely. "Beautiful animal. That Rodriguez girl, Emma, she brought him home yesterday. Poor child been struggling since her grandmother got sick. Don't know where she got the money for a dog like that, but he seems real gentle with her." "Emma Rodriguez?" Sarah's training kicked in, her mind already cataloguing details. "Which apartment?" "2B, just down the hall." But honey, you should know, that girl's been through enough hardship for 3 lifetimes. Whatever this is about, I hope you ain't here to make her life harder. Sarah's emotions were a churning mixture of hope, anxiety, and something else she couldn't quite identify. After 6 weeks of nightmares and desperate searching, she might be minutes away from seeing Max again. But the situation was more complicated than she had imagined. This wasn't a case of finding Max in some criminal's hideout. He was apparently with a young woman who seemed to be caring for him. She knocked on the door of apartment 2B with hands that trembled slightly. The sound of footsteps approached, followed by a voice she recognized from her police training, the careful, wary tone of someone who had learned not to trust unexpected visitors. "Who is it?" "Atlanta Police. I need to speak with Emma Rodriguez about a dog." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Sarah to wonder if the person inside was going to answer at all. Then she heard the soft sound of multiple locks being undone, and the door opened to reveal a young woman who looked like she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. Emma Rodriguez was smaller than Sarah had expected, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and clothes that had been washed so many times they were soft with age. But it was her eyes that caught Sarah's attention. They held a wariness that spoke of too much responsibility at too young an age, and a fierce protectiveness that Sarah recognized in herself. "Is this about Max?" Emma asked quietly, her body positioned to block the doorway. The sound of his name hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Max is here?" As if summoned by the familiar voice, a shape moved in the shadows behind Emma. Sarah's heart stopped as she saw him, thinner than before, still showing signs of his ordeal, but unmistakably, wonderfully Max. "Max!" The word came out as part sob, part prayer. The transformation in Max was instantaneous and electric. His head snapped up, his entire body went rigid with attention, and then he was moving, pushing past Emma with the urgency of 6 weeks of separation and grief, suddenly colliding with hope. But he stopped just short of Sarah, his training and intelligence creating a moment of hesitation that broke Sarah's heart all over again. He looked back at Emma, then at Sarah, his confusion evident as he tried to process the collision of his old life with his new reality. "It's okay, boy," Emma said softly, her voice thick with an emotion Sarah couldn't quite interpret. "Go to her. She's been looking for you." The permission was all Max needed. He launched himself at Sarah with a force that knocked her back against the hallway wall, his entire body vibrating with joy and relief. Sarah dropped to her knees, burying her face in his familiar fur, feeling 6 weeks of fear and desperation dissolve into overwhelming gratitude. "I thought I'd lost you forever," she whispered into his coat, feeling his solid warmth against her chest. "I never stopped looking. I never stopped believing." But even as she held him, Sarah became aware of something unexpected. Max wasn't pulling away from Emma or showing any signs of wanting to leave with Sarah immediately. Instead, he kept looking back at the young woman who stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself as if holding her own heart together. "You're his partner," Emma said. It wasn't a question. Sarah looked up, still holding Max but seeing Emma clearly for the first time. The girl's face was a careful mask, but her eyes told a different story, one of loss and resignation that Sarah recognized because she had been living it herself for the past 6 weeks. "Officer Sarah Collins, Canine Unit," she said, rising slowly to her feet. "Max and I have been partners for 6 years. I bought him at an auction," Emma said quickly, as if trying to get ahead of whatever accusations might be coming. "I didn't steal him. I paid everything I had." "You bought him?" Sarah's police instincts engaged, but she forced herself to focus on understanding rather than interrogating. "From who?" "I don't know their names. I work cleaning jobs sometimes, and one of them was at this warehouse. I saw him there, saw how sad he looked, and Emma's voice broke slightly. "I couldn't leave him there. I spent my last $300 to get him out." The simple honesty in Emma's voice hit Sarah harder than any elaborate explanation could have. This young woman had sacrificed everything she had to save a dog she didn't know. simply because she couldn't bear to see him suffer. $300? Sarah asked, her voice soft with disbelief. It was all I had, Emma said, lifting her chin with a pride that reminded Sarah of Max's own dignity. I know it probably doesn't seem like much to you, but it was everything to me. Sarah looked at Max, who continued to divide his attention between the two women with an intelligence that suggested he understood exactly what was happening. He pressed against Sarah's leg with familiar affection, but he also kept glancing back at Emma with something that looked remarkably like concern. He hasn't been eating much, Emma said, filling the silence. I think he's been sad. I tried to take good care of him, but I think he knew he didn't belong with me. And he's been eating, Sarah said, studying Max's physical condition with practiced eyes. He's lost weight, but he's not malnourished. You've been taking care of him. The acknowledgement seemed to surprise Emma. I did my best. I know I don't know much about police dogs, but I couldn't just let him stay in that place. Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest, a recognition of something she hadn't expected to find at the end of her search. She had thought this moment would be simple. Find Max, arrest whoever had him, take him home. But Emma Rodriguez wasn't a criminal. She was a young woman who had risked everything to save a stranger's dog because her heart wouldn't let her do anything else. Emma, Sarah said carefully, I need to understand something. You spent everything you had to save him, knowing he belonged to someone else. I hoped someone was looking for him, Emma admitted. A dog like him, trained like him, someone had to love him enough to never stop searching. I just couldn't leave him in that cage, knowing what might happen to him. Max chose that moment to do something that surprised both women. He walked deliberately to Emma's side and sat down, his posture alert and protective. Then he looked at Sarah with an expression she had never seen before, one that seemed to be trying to communicate something beyond the scope of their usual partnership. I think, Sarah said slowly, watching Max's behavior with growing amazement, he's trying to tell me something. Emma knelt down and placed her hand gently on Max's head. What is it, boy? What are you trying to say? Max looked between the two women, then did something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. He moved to position himself between them, his body language clearly indicating that he wanted them both to stay, that somehow, in the space of just a few days, this young woman had become someone he felt responsible for protecting. Sarah Collins, who had spent 6 weeks believing that finding Max would solve everything, suddenly realized that the real story was just beginning. For the next hour, Sarah found herself in the most unusual situation of her law enforcement career, sitting on a worn couch in a tiny apartment, drinking instant coffee, and trying to understand the complex emotional dynamics between herself, a 19-year-old girl, and a police dog who seemed determined to rewrite the rules of loyalty. Max had positioned himself precisely in the center of the small living room, where he could maintain visual contact with both women. Every few minutes, he would get up, walk to Sarah for a brief moment of physical contact, a head bump against her knee, a gentle placement of his paw on her foot, and then return to Emma's side, where he would sit with the same protective alertness he had always shown with Sarah. I've never seen him behave like this, Sarah admitted, watching Max's careful choreography with fascination. In 6 years, he's never shown this kind of divided attention. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor beside Max, her hand resting on his back. He talks to me, she said quietly. Not with words, obviously, but he communicates. Yesterday, when I was crying about my grandmother's medication, he brought me his water bowl. I think he was trying to share. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. In all their years together, Max had been the perfect professional partner, loyal, obedient, focused. But what Emma was describing sounded like something deeper, more personal, more human. Your grandmother is sick? Sarah asked, her police instinct shifting into a different mode entirely. Heart condition. She raised me after my parents died. The medication is expensive, and since I spent the money on Max... Emma's voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Sarah looked around the apartment with new eyes, seeing details she had missed in her initial focus on finding Max. The medical equipment in the corner, the pill bottles organized on the kitchen counter, the careful way everything was clean but clearly worn from years of making do with too little. "Emma, can I ask you something?" Sarah said carefully. "When you saw Max at that auction, what made you decide to save him?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working through Max's fur with the unconscious gentleness of someone who had been caring for others her entire life. "My grandmother always told me that we're put on earth to take care of each other," she said finally. "She said that sometimes we have to choose between what's practical and what's right, and that the right choice isn't always the easy one." She looked up at Sarah with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. "When I saw him in that cage, looking so sad and dignified at the same time, I knew someone loved him. Someone was missing him the way I would miss my grandmother if something happened to her. I couldn't leave him there." Max chose that moment to do something extraordinary. He stood up, walked deliberately to the corner where Emma kept her grandmother's medical supplies, and returned carrying a prescription bottle in his mouth. He placed it carefully at Sarah's feet, then sat down and looked between the two women with an expression that was unmistakably purposeful. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, understanding hitting her like lightning. "He's asking me to help her." Emma stared at Max in amazement. "How could he possibly know that I need—" "Because he's brilliant," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "And because he sees you the same way he sees me, as someone who needs protecting." The silence that followed was filled with the weight of recognition. Max wasn't choosing between them. He was asking them to choose each other. Sarah pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. "What's your grandmother's name, and what medication does she need?" "Sarah, you don't have to—" "Emma, listen to me," Sarah interrupted, looking up from her phone with an intensity that made the young woman stop talking. "6 weeks ago, I thought I had lost everything that mattered to me. Today, because of your courage and compassion, I have him back. More than that, I can see that he's learned something about love that he never knew before, something you taught him." She stood up and began pacing the small room, her mind working through possibilities with the same systematic approach she used to solve cases. "Here's what's going to happen. I have connections at the police department, contacts in social services, and 6 years of favors I can call in. Your grandmother is going to get the medical care she needs. This apartment is going to pass every safety inspection, and you're going to have opportunities that match your intelligence and your heart." "Why would you do that?" Emma asked, tears making her voice shaky. Sarah knelt down in front of Max, who moved to position himself between the two women again, his body language radiating satisfaction at their growing connection. "Because he's asking me to," she said simply. "And because in 6 years of partnership, Max has never been wrong about people. If he thinks you're worth protecting, then you're family." She reached into her wallet and pulled out a business card, writing additional numbers on the back. "My personal cell, my captain's direct line, and the number for a social worker who specializes in family assistance programs. I want you to call all of them tomorrow." Emma took the card with hands that trembled slightly. "What about Max? He belongs with you." Sarah looked at her partner, who was watching this exchange with the focused attention he usually reserved for crime scenes. "Max, what do you want to do?" Max stood up and walked to the apartment door, then back to Sarah, then to Emma, then to the door again. His message was clear. He wanted all of them to leave together. "I think," Sarah said slowly, "he's telling us that families don't have to look like what we expected them to look like." Over the next 2 hours, they worked out a plan that none of them could have imagined that morning. Emma would move her grandmother to a better facility that Sarah's insurance contacts could arrange, funded by a combination of police family assistance programs and community resources that Sarah knew how to access. Emma would also start training as a police department volunteer, working with the canine unit to develop her natural gift for understanding animals. And Max would split his time between his professional duties with Sarah and what could only be described as his personal mission of watching over Emma and her grandmother. "This is crazy," Emma said as they walked through the logistics. "Things like this don't happen to people like me. People like you save police dogs with their last $300, Sarah replied. I think the universe might owe you a few miracles. As the sun began to set over Atlanta, the three of them sat together in Emma's tiny living room. Sarah on the couch, Emma on the floor, and Max positioned where he could touch both of them. For the first time in 6 weeks, Sarah felt complete. Not just because she had found Max, but because Max had found something in Emma that made all of them better than they had been alone. You know, Sarah said, watching Max's contentment as he rested his head on Emma's knee while keeping one paw touching Sarah's foot. I think he planned this whole thing. Emma laughed, the first genuine laughter Sarah had heard from her. You think he got himself kidnapped just so we would meet? I think Max is smarter than both of us, Sarah said, scratching behind his ears. And I think he knew that I needed to learn something about love that only you could teach. Max's tail wagged once, slowly, as if agreeing with the assessment. 6 months later, Officer Sarah Collins and Canine Max would be featured in the Atlanta Police Department's community newsletter, not for solving a major case, but for their work with the new youth animal care program that Emma Rodriguez had helped design. The program paired at-risk youth with retired police animals, creating bonds that transformed both the kids and the dogs. Emma would be enrolled in college on a scholarship that mysteriously appeared after several phone calls from someone in the police department studying veterinary medicine with a focus on working animals. Her grandmother would receive the best cardiac care in Atlanta, her treatment fully covered by a combination of community resources and anonymous donations. And Max would continue to split his time between his professional duties and his self-appointed role as guardian angel to a young woman who had saved him with her last coins and taught him that sometimes the most important job a dog can have is knowing when to bring two lonely hearts together. But on this evening, as the three of them sat in that tiny apartment sharing takeout pizza that Sarah had insisted on buying, none of them were thinking about the future. They were focused on the miracle of the present moment, the perfect rightness of a family that had been assembled not by blood or law, but by a dog who understood love better than the humans who thought they were rescuing him. Max's silent plea had been heard, answered, and transformed into something beautiful that would change all their lives forever.